Hello listeners, today I'm going to discuss the issue of gay marriage. This has very much been in the news recently, with Liberals doing a victory lap over recent events. But I'm going to discuss gay marriage and specifically how it relates to being a means of destroying resistance to tyranny. Now, it's going to take me several steps to sort of get to that eventual conclusion, so bear with me, because I think I need to talk about those things along the way. There'll be a few little side discussions on things that don't initially appear to relate to that. But I hope that you will see or understand by the end of this talk why I will do those things, or why I have done those things by that point. Okay, so the first thing I would like to do is actually talk about marriage equality as Liberals define it. Now, there is, of course, nothing equal about a gay marriage and a straight marriage. They're not the same thing, despite how Liberals will try to portray them as being such. That's not actually true. And I think there are at least three very important differences between gay marriage and straight marriage. The first one, of course, the most obvious one, is that gay marriage does not produce children naturally. Either they need to use IVF or surrogacy or something like that, or they need to adopt. But gay marriage in and of itself does not produce children, and I ultimately believe that the purpose of marriage, the ultimate objective of marriage, is the production of children. I ultimately believe that the ultimate meaning of life is also the production of children and the passing on of your genes down through time and space. So that's the first difference. The second difference is that the gay marriage is not even that popular with gays. There has been no stampede by gays towards becoming married anywhere. It simply hasn't occurred. So it wasn't even really that significant an issue within the gay community until others jumped on the bandwagon. It's being pushed by other people, and you'll sort of start to see that there are some useful idiots who have been pushing it. The majority of people have simply been useful idiots. I mean, you look at this whole thing, for instance, on Facebook with those stupid profile pictures with the rainbow flag. My sister-in-law, who is really a completely apolitical person as far as I can tell, she never ever mentions anything along those lines. I don't think she would even really have any opinions, or certainly not any deep opinions on any kind of political issue. Not just things that are sort of left or right, but any sort of political or civic issue. She's the kind of person who, in her Facebook feed, it's all photos of her making duck faces with bowls of noodles and so on. It's all, sort of very frivolous stuff, fashion, all of this kind of thing, right? And yet even she jumped on this bandwagon, and I don't know whether that's sort of evidence of how this has actually become normalised, or whether the whole thing, in some sense, has actually jumped the shark when people like that are doing it, But nevertheless, I do believe that it's being pushed by other people. It's not gays themselves. They haven't all rushed to go and get married. Very few, a tiny percentage. So marriage is not a norm within the gay community, whereas it is. It very much is a norm, though it's changing in the straight community. Certainly amongst middle class people, it's a norm. It has been for a very long time. As I said, it's changing though. And this leads on to the third issue, which is that gay marriages, even when they exist, are often a complete sham in how we imagine marriage to be, how it's traditionally been conceived as basically a sort of monogamous unit. There's a massive amount of adultery, promiscuity amongst gays, whether they're married or unmarried. It's rampant, in fact. Now, of course, people have affairs, and there's that sort of thing also within straight couples or straight marriages even. But, it's a much, much smaller thing. Generally speaking, the norm, at least for a very long time, and even now I think, is that most couples are pretty monogamous. That's simply not the case with gay marriages. So, all of these sort of ideas that have been pushed by liberals that gay marriages are just like straight marriages. They've been very successful and they've been very clever about how they've done this, but there's an intellectual sleight of hand that has occurred there. Okay, so I'd like to actually move on to discussing marriage itself. Now, I believe that marriage exists as a self-contained economy. Essentially, it's the family, the household exists as a self-contained economy. Now, of course, in modern days, economies, whether for the individual family or in terms of societies, they're far more complex than they've ever been. But nevertheless, I still think to a large degree, families exist as a self-contained economy. Now, in the traditional sense, men, women, and children all had very well-defined roles within the family, very well-defined functions and purposes. Sometimes they overlapped, but generally there was a particular reason for that. And I'll go into what those were. Men worked. They did a variety of different things. It depended, some of them might have been tradesmen, some of them, or craftsmen, some of them may have been labourers, and of course, as society became more industrialised and middle class and so on, many of them did white-collar work as well. But nevertheless, men went out of the home, generally speaking, every day, whether they went over to the farm or whether they went into a workshop or they went to an office or something like that. They went out of the home and worked, and brought home the majority of the income, or produced the majority of the food, or that kind of stuff that sustains the household, the family. Women also worked. In some ways, the feminist notion that began to be pushed in the middle of the 20th century, that the women were bound in the house and all of that, was only true of a very particular subset of women, basically upper class or upper middle class white women. That wasn't true of women in other classes or other races in the West. They didn't have that luxury. They still needed to work. So women went out of the house as well, or they did work in the house. They often did things like sewing and so on, and produced some sort of work within the house. They produced handicrafts, either to sell or to earn money, or for the use of that house, of that family itself. Women have always worked. It's only a very small percentage of the populace of women who haven't worked because their men couldn't afford to support them in leisure, to keep them as kept women. And of course, women also contribute to the house in performing household duties, cooking, cleaning, etc. And of course, they raise children. Primarily they were the ones who raised children. So they were a very important part of the household economy as well, at least as important as men. The two couldn't have existed without one another. And then there were children. Now, initially, children have always been a large drain upon the household's resources. Until a particular age, they basically don't contribute, and they haven't contributed. And as our society has become more complex and so on, that age has increased through adolescence and even into the 20s in many cases, or beyond in many families these days. But traditionally, children, they eventually reached the point where they stopped being a net drain upon the household's resources and started to actually become a net positive. I mean, that was part of the incentive for having them. Otherwise, people wouldn't have produced children, and I think that's part of why people aren't having as many children these days, because the cost of having them is so high, and they don't contribute anything for decades in many cases these days. And so they are a huge net drain. And they're sort of a bad investment for modern people in many ways. Whereas in the past, they were actually a very good investment. You had to sort of deal with them up front. There were a lot of upfront costs and ongoing costs until there were maybe, around 10 approximately. But then they could start earning their keep. whether that was to go out with the husband in the fields or in his workshop and, you know, be apprenticed to him, that kind of stuff, or whether if they were female, they would remain in the house and basically become an assistant to the mother, doing, you know, her handicrafts or her household chores or helping to raise younger siblings. But nevertheless, there was a sort of a point at which they became a net benefit, and that's why people had children, obviously. And also because later on, when the parents of that household became old and their ability to function sort of diminished, their ability to be productive diminished, their children would serve as a kind of a retirement policy for them. So there were clearly defined roles, and basically the family could actually function as a pretty individual unit, a fairly self-sufficient individual unit. And the best example of this is to look at colonial times or frontier homesteads, that kind of thing in the US or Canada, Australia, New Zealand and so on, where often people lived in the middle of nowhere, literally the middle of nowhere. The nearest town might have been a day's journey away, and so people didn't go to town very frequently. And when they did go to town, they tended to buy things that they couldn't produce themselves, and those things were few and far between. So they either bought raw materials, so something like iron, for instance, or even cloth. Sometimes they produced their own cloth, but generally not. So they would obtain their raw materials like that. Maybe some things that were slightly more developed, you know, so nails, for instance, or something like that. But generally, they would buy things that they couldn't produce themselves, so, you know, sugar, salt, that kind of stuff. And they would then fashion those raw materials into finished goods themselves, whether that was you know, a tool and then building a house themselves, or clothing, or whether it was you know, baking their own food, for instance. But they didn't go and buy all these ready-made items. The few things that they did acquire were the bare minimum that they couldn't produce themselves, or that would have been very inefficient for them to produce themselves. But basically everything they used in their lives, they manufactured themselves. Tools, often they produced their own tools, they grew their own food, they built their own houses, they made their own clothes, all of that kind of stuff. And they were very economically self-sufficient. They had to be, because they didn't have the luxury of living in a big city and being able to engage in sort of very specialised roles in commerce and so on. And the family could do that. The family was quite capable of doing that, generally speaking. With almost no interaction with other people unless, you know, they absolutely had to. So the family was a very stable unit as a result. Everyone knew what they were doing and they contributed, and it all worked. Now, in conjunction with that, there are a couple of things that went along with that. There was the notion of property rights, and there was also a notion of representation or the consent of the governed. And these issues actually stretch quite a long way back into Northern European history. The origins of them are with the Germanic tribes. They may even stretch well into antiquity. I'm not such an expert on that kind of stuff, but they certainly go back probably at least 1500 years. The Anglo-Saxons, who arrived in the United Kingdom in that period of the Great Migrations, which was sort of from when, like the 3rd century to about the 10th century, but I think they arrived around the 5th and 6th centuries mainly. They had a tradition that was very different to Southern Europe, and that has really carried on to this day, in that the chieftain or the king, he was powerful, of course, and people paid him tax and so on, but his ability to rule required that he couldn't be a tyrant. And there were several reasons for this. Firstly, his warriors were armed. They had their own weapons, they produced their own weapons. He couldn't just be a tyrant to them. He would be overthrown. He would be challenged. He didn't have absolute rule. He required those people. Often also because these people were migrating and they needed to work together, because they often found themselves in opposition to people who were already there. And so the Germanic tribes, the level of power difference between the rulers and the average person was quite low. Those people were armed and they were able to defend themselves, and that acted as a check against tyranny. And they were economically quite self-sufficient as well, because they didn't have as much specialisation as people who were very urban, for instance. And so these traditions, as I said, they're 1,500 years old, and they form very much the basis of the Anglosphere culture, and they form the basis of our political systems, parliament, and the Althing, which was a gathering essentially of tribesmen in Iceland, but they would get together and discuss things. It was democratic is not quite the right word because it wasn't everyone, but nevertheless it was free men essentially, free men who were there to represent their household, and the leaders had to have the consent of those people. And they needed to rely upon them for resources. They didn't just dole things out to people. They needed to rely upon those people to fight for them. They needed to rely upon those people to provide the goods that would allow the chieftain to rule. And I believe that there's a sort of a concerted effort to break this down. And I'll get into that a little bit more in the rest of this talk. But nevertheless, the family unit in Northern European history represented a very stable building block for civilization, Western civilization. The fact that men were relatively free, the fact that they had property rights and the chieftain or king couldn't just arbitrarily take property away from them, that afforded them the ability to engage in commerce and science and all of these things and develop Western civilization. The two are connected at a very intimate level. And destroying those links, I believe, ultimately will be quite calamitous for Western society. If you have a compliant populace, you're not going to have a populace that engages in inquiry, scientific inquiry, and all of this sort of stuff that creates great works of architecture and art and so on. You won't have those things. Those things have been quite absent in many other civilizations, generally speaking. So let me move on slightly. And we can actually see the breakdown of that and just how disastrous it has been in black communities, in the black community in the US. Now, of course, the black community was never as functional as the white community. Black families were never as functional as white families. They had more social ills attached to them. That said, until the 1960s, the black family was relatively functional. It was fairly functional. Of course, it had more problems than the white family, but it was still relatively functional, at least in comparison to what we see today. The black family now, as an institution, is all but gone. 70% of black children in America are born out of wedlock. I mean, marriage is and the family, it literally doesn't exist in black America now. It's only it's the minority of people who actually have that structure now. And look what has happened. Every social ill you can possibly think of, property crime, murder, drug use, poor educational achievement, and so on and so forth. Every single achievement and metric that you can imagine that's bad has just gone exponential in those communities because the families have completely broken down. There's no male authority in those families, and even more importantly, is that those families are not independent. They lack that financial independence and the sort of ability to check tyranny because the father and the family have essentially been replaced by the government. The government now is the person who brings home the bacon, so to speak. There's no father bringing home the bacon in black communities anymore, in the majority of cases. There's no father to offer discipline and guidance and so on to boys in particular, but also girls, daughters. The government has overtaken that role and is doing a pretty bad job at it, actually. And that's why black communities are just in complete chaos at the moment. They're in free fall. And of course, we're starting to see that occurring with white families as well, or the white community. What was the former white white lower class, the blue collar whites and so on? that group of people have basically just completely fallen apart by the deindustrialization and the globalization of Western societies. And we've seen sort of an attendant range of social ills, the same kinds of things that are occurring in the black communities and have been for decades. We're seeing that filtering through into lower class or underclass white communities now as well. And Charles Murray has done quite a thorough investigation and analysis of this. And I believe that we're actually starting to see that filtering up into the middle class or the former middle class in the West as well, with white people, and I suppose in other ethnic groups as well, probably even in the black middle class, from what I understand, that there's sort of a regression to the mean, or there are people pulling, anyone who's black who wants to get out of that gets pulled back down into it. But nevertheless, we're certainly seeing that with the lower class and even the middle class with white families too. That they're becoming highly dysfunctional, and the number of out of wedlock births and all of this sort of stuff is going exponential also. Now, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about welfare and so on. Of course, the people who are getting welfare and who have sort of replaced the father, so women who have replaced the father or the husband with the government, they think they're getting a lot of free stuff, of course. They think it's great. In two ways. They think they're getting free stuff, and they think they have license. Now, in terms of the former, yes, they're getting some free stuff, though how much longer that can be sustained for is open to question, because you still need the people who are actually producing the stuff for that to be redistributed to those other people who are not producing anything, because those people are essentially completely unproductive in a whole lot of ways, not just economically. And as long as there's a sizable enough middle class, particularly white, but other groups as well to some extent, as long as there's a sizable enough class of those people, then the welfare can continue. But as the middle class disappears, or as the middle class sort of opt out, then it's going to be harder and harder and harder to sustain that. And I believe we're seeing the initial stages of that now. So, the free stuff is not going to continue for that much longer. And then in terms of license, again, they think they can do whatever they want, but, the consequences of that are going to come back and haunt them in a similar way to the economic consequences coming back to haunt them. And of course, the government has them exactly where it wants them, because the government can literally say, well, we'll turn the welfare on or off. And so they are actually sort of enslaved or indentured to the government. The government can manipulate them very easily, and I'll get on to a bit more of that later. Now, to sort of bring this back to gay people to some extent, well, I don't think gay people are ever going to be a large percentage of the population. I think it will always be well under 10%. It's only a couple of percent at the moment. It's never going to be 20 or 50%, that kind of thing. So, at one level, the impact they will have on the family and society is minimal, because there just aren't enough of them. And even if they don't have kids, they will be replaced, of course, by immigrants or the children of immigrants. And so everyone thinks, all right, that's fine, that's also because the elite increasingly see everyone as simply a replaceable cog in an economic machine. And so, if a white person is gay and doesn't have a kid, you can just replace them with an immigrant, right? Or the immigrant's kid. That's not a problem, according to them. Now, of course, we think it will be for a whole lot of reasons. But nevertheless, I don't think they're the problem themselves. And this is where I'm sort of getting to the real meat of this talk. Because I don't think the gays are actually the issue. I don't think gay marriage is about gay people. I don't think it's about their right to marriage. What it is a wedge to drive into the traditional family unit, because, as I've already outlined, the family unit represents a self-sufficient unit. It has no need for some sort of tyrannical overlord. It doesn't need that person. They can do quite well without that person or group of people. So for those people, if they want to have complete power, they need to break the kind of thing that will be resistant to them, the kind of thing that will provide a check upon their power, the kind of thing that won't depend upon them totally. So they need to destroy the primarily white middle class family, but certainly the traditional family unit. They need to destroy that. And gays, like all of these other groups, women, blacks, whatever, they're all just pawns. The people pulling the strings, they don't actually care about women and their empowerment. They don't care about blacks and their empowerment. I mean, it's quite obvious that they don't care about blacks. It's also quite obvious once you look at it that they don't care about women. These groups are unhappier than ever. They're more dysfunctional than ever. How has that been a net win for women or blacks? And gays are slightly different. I mean, they sort of, have gay marriage, but as I've already said, not many of them are adopting it, and even when they do, it's all a bit of a sham. But nevertheless, it's not about the gays. It's a wedge to drive into the family unit, to break the resistance to tyranny, essentially. And it's not the only wedge that they're driving in. I mean, there are others that have been continuing for a while, so the acceptance of single mother households. But there are some others that they're going to start promoting now. I think now they've had this victory, they're going to move on to the next thing. Well, they've also had the trans thing that's sort of pretty much in the bag now. They're going to start moving on to open marriage. That's going to be a big one, because that will really undermine the foundations of the family unit. And eventually they're going to move on to the idea that marriage itself is a bad thing. They'll sort of, it's always done by degrees. They will eventually get to the point where they will define marriage itself as a bad thing, as some sort of, right-wing conservative hate crime almost, being married. That it's very subversive to the state and all of this sort of stuff. That's where they're going, and they're going to introduce things like incest and pedophilia. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, if you introduce incest and pedophilia, then children become damaged, and when they grow up to be adults, it's going to be very difficult for them to form normal, trusting, functional, stable relationships, and therefore a normal, trusting, stable family unit, and they're going to be atomized. They're going to be very easy to control then, because they won't have that sort of a self-sufficient, self-contained economic and cultural unit that has always been represented by the traditional family within Northern Europe and its descendants in North America and the Antipodes and so on. So that's what they're doing, basically. That's what all of this has been about. It has nothing to do with gay people. That's just the cover story, and that's just, the thing that the useful idiots on the left have latched onto. Being useful idiots, that's what they do. They can't see beyond the obvious, or beyond what's pushed on them at the surface level. They can't see beyond that to what's really going on. They're cannon fodder in this cultural war. And of course, the great irony of all of this is that SJWs and all of these people, they're highly dysfunctional. I mean, they don't form stable family units. They're completely dependent upon the government. Many of them, they're swimming in debt. They're living very dysfunctional lives. They're not economically self-sufficient, and they live together, but they're not a family. They don't have that sort of support network and the roles that reinforce each other, where the sum is greater than the total of the parts. They don't have that. And the great irony of all of this is that despite being the true believers and so on, they are only cannon fodder. All of the changes that are coming in the next 20 years, the tyranny that is going to be pushed on people as the checks are slowly cracked and removed, the family unit and various other things also, as those things are slowly chipped away at, with wedges being driven into them and so on, what will remain will be this dystopian situation, and the SJWs will actually find that out, I believe. They can't see it now, but I think they will start to find that out. Now, I think that to some extent, all of this is inevitable. I think it's going to happen. It seems to be this epoch in time, this tide of history that's occurring, and it's difficult to swim against the tide. I think it's going to happen. I think it has to get worse even. I'm very much of the mind that reform in a whole lot of areas in Western society now, reform is basically not possible. We're going to have to go down into the abyss all the way, right to the bottom of the abyss. We can't sort of go partway in and say, oh no, right, we'll turn back and we'll go out again. It doesn't work that way. You have to go all the way to the bottom. You have to descend completely, totally. And then you can begin to come out of it, possibly. It's not a foregone conclusion that we will, but possibly. But I think we're going to have to go all the way in there. I don't think we can change this. I don't think we can necessarily stop this, right? I mean, look, this whole issue of gay marriage, 5 years ago, 8 years ago, it was a fringe movement, and even within the past year, I mean, it's just moved so rapidly, and the whole thing with transsexuals as well, that's moved so rapidly. All of these things that they're going to start pushing now, they're going to move incredibly rapidly, more so than anyone could predict right now, and more so than anyone would have expected even just a few years ago. I mean, it's bizarre. I don't think we can really resist that directly. I think what we need to do, though, if you'll pardon the pun, is to make sure that we have our own houses in order. I think that's all we can do. We have to weather the storm. We have to descend into the abyss and be able to descend out of and ascend out of it. A lot of other people are going to fall by the wayside, but we have to make sure that we're resistant. So we have to find the right people as partners. We need to create stable, productive, self-sufficient households and children. And we need to do the same within a broader community or set of broader communities. Basically, we need to have our acts together as individuals and communities, or families, communities, and so on, because it's going to get rough. We can't get out of this. There have been lots of periods in history before when it looked like the world was falling apart, and yet people survived. They came out the other end of it and they rebuilt. That's certainly the case in the West. It's happened in many other civilizations also, particularly Chinese history. That's a recurring theme in Chinese history. We can do it. We just have to be resilient. All these other people are not going to be resilient. They're going to be unable to resist it, but we have to try to make sure that we can resist it. We won't stop it, but we can resist it and protect ourselves and our children, our grandchildren, and so on. And eventually they will rebuild. But whenever someone talks to you about this whole topic, just remember, it's not about the gays. They're just a set of useful idiots. They're just pawns. All of those people on your Facebook feed who have those stupid flags, they're just pawns. That's all they are. It's annoying, but that's all they are. And it's all about tyranny. It's all about this creeping tyranny, and that's going to be a recurring theme in many of my other talks. So I hope you have found this informative or thought-provoking or something along those lines. Thanks for listening.